Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I know some people may be joining us as in the next few minutes, but including hopefully one of our presenters. So I'm Elaine Ikeda with California Campus Compact, and California Campus Compact and Campus Compact of the Mountain West are pleased to bring you another one of our webinars, our series. We've been doing a series of webinars this year. This one is called External Reviews of Civic Engagement Programs, and we felt that we were hearing more and more from folks that they were thinking about doing an external review or getting requests for information about how to conduct an external review of their service learning or civic engagement program. So we thought it might be nice to put together a little session on things to think about and hear from one of our campuses that actually recently went through an external review, so you'll have some on the ground, hands-on experienced folks talking about that, as well as hearing from some of us who've actually conducted an external review. So our presenters today are Julia Vanderine, who's the director of the Service Learning Program at Dominican University and also is an associate professor of philosophy there. And our other presenter, who for some reason we're not quite sure isn't on yet, but I can cover her part until she does join us, is Megan Voorhees, who's in a consulting role. She consults with a lot of, she does a lot of consulting work with Minnesota Campus Compact and has done some work with California Campus Compact. And a few years ago, before she moved to the Midwest, she was the director of the UC Berkeley Public Service Center in California. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie so she can do a brief overview of our webinar platform.
Great, thanks. So for those of you who have not used Zoom before, we love it. We're going to go through some different ways that you as participants will be able to make your voices heard, so to speak, even though you are in a listen-only mode, which you probably have noticed already that you are not able to share your voice that way. So when using Zoom, what they do is for webinars, the facilitators, we all have our cameras on, but in order to keep the noise clutter down, which invariably happens, all of the participants are in the listen-only mode. So there's two ways that you as participants can post questions and comments, which we would love to hear about so that we can incorporate them into the Q&A at the very end of the webinar. The first one is there's a Q&A button, and that really is intended to be the way in which you submit questions that you want to make sure you get answers to before the webinar is over. I mean, this is a really great opportunity to have folks that are very knowledgeable in this content area at your disposal to be able to ask questions that will help you take this information back to your institution or back to whoever you want to talk about it with, and be able to move forward with something like this if it's of interest to you in your campus. So please use the Q&A button. You can post questions in there. It does not have to be at the end. So throughout the webinar, use the Q&A button and put your questions in. There's also a chat button that is there, and that really is more for sort of ongoing comments, or for example, if you know of other models that are out there, other institutions, other programs that are doing something really well, and you want to share that information with other folks that are on the webinar, feel free to put all of those comments and suggestions into the chat box. And all of those are logged as part of the recording of the webinar, which you all will receive a link to via YouTube after the webinar concludes. So feel free to share that link with whomever you would like. Our intention is really to make this content as open as possible so that folks can really use it and it can do good at other institutions. When you receive the email that has the link to the recording of the webinar, we'll also attach all of the slides that you'll see today. So don't worry about having to scribble notes or try to keep up if there's a lot of content on one of the slides. You'll receive the entire deck afterwards. So that will come to you. And then the final piece is going to be an evaluation link. And we would greatly appreciate it if you would take a couple of minutes and fill out an evaluation on how we can do this better, or if there's other content you'd like to see developed and shared in future webinars. Because again, the intention here is to make this as relevant as possible. So we appreciate your participation in answering those evaluations. If you have any questions following the webinar, that's my email address, and you should have it already from registration, but feel free to get in touch regardless. So I am going to turn it back over to Elaine to do just a brief overview of the Compact and our partnership and our role in putting on the webinar series, and then we'll jump into content.
So hopefully most of you are familiar with Campus Compact. I'll just say a brief word. You know, we're a presidential membership organization that's been around since 1985 as a national organization, and we provide resources and support to colleges that are in our membership. If you are not a Campus Compact member and are interested, please just get in touch with myself or Stephanie, and we can provide you with more information. But part of what we do is provide resources and support to our member campuses, and these webinars are a way of doing that. Stephanie's office, Campus Compact of the Mountain West, and California Campus Compact, we collaborated on a series of webinar presentations. I think this is maybe the sixth this year so far. But anyway, so we will move forward and get started now talking about external review. So thanks, Stephanie. So there's lots of different reasons for doing an external review, and for those of you who may not be as familiar with external reviews, we kind of, if you're a faculty member, you're probably actually quite familiar, because a lot of departments, academic units go through external review, and I think it's been a more recent adaptation that our service learning centers and our civic engagement centers have started to adapt some of those practices and create external reviews for our programs as well. So it definitely provides an opportunity for reflection, and when most of the time we're bringing in folks from outside the university to do these external reviews, and you may choose to bring in people from peer institutions, and therefore you may get some new ideas and strategies from your peers out there in the field. Some of our campuses like to use this external review for informing their own strategic planning process, and then the data can help you to advocate for additional resources or other kinds of support from stakeholders. So there's a variety of reasons you might choose to do an external review. So it's important to think about, what are your goals for the review? You know, why are you wanting to conduct a review? And for some reason, Stephanie, I can't see the whole screen. Anyway, so I don't know if there's anything I can do on my end, but I can't see the right-hand side of the screen. Anyway, so what do you want the reviewers to focus on? And so we have listed here a couple of several links to some standards that you could use to inform your review process and use as a guideline for, strange, my screen is now blank.
Mine too.
Oh no.
Yeah, you know, we'll be sending you this, so you can click to these links.
They're hyperlinked.
Yeah, they're hyperlinked, so when you get the PowerPoint later, you can actually look at some of these links to standards that are out there. You know, some of us use the Andrew Furco self-assessment rubric for institutionalization for this kind of a review. You could also, I've had a number of campuses talk about applying for the Carnegie Foundation community engagement classification, and so using that framework and the criteria that they're using as a way to frame their review. So it would be important for you to be thinking strategically about, what are your goals? What are the outcomes you would like to see come out of it? Does your campus have expectations? Are there resources to support the process? Because that may also dictate how you do the review. If your funding is really limited, it might, and we'll get into this a little later, determine who you can bring from the outside, how many days, etc. And we'll get into those little details a little bit further. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Julia to talk a little, give a little context, as she's sort of our case study since she recently went through this, and she can talk more about her process.
Right. Hi. So we actually just had our external review on November 5th, 2015. And so kind of still in the process. What I can say is definitely context matters. So you need to think about the context of your institution, what your driving questions are, because that will really determine the approach you take and the reviewers that you have, and many other aspects of the review. For us, our context was that we were in this pivotal moment where our strategic directions were kind of gelling, and we had multiple institutional initiatives that were beginning to be fleshed out and framed. We also, very importantly, had a new director of assessment who really was supportive, because actually I was like one of those crazy people who was begging for an external review and actually very engaged with assessment. And at the same time this fall, I also had a new person came in who Service Learning was reporting to, who is also responsible for a lot of initiatives that Service Learning should be better aligned with. So it was a really important moment that we saw as a real opportunity to think more systemically and address some of the disconnects and gaps that have been kind of hindering further institutionalization.
One additional possibility, and thanks to Dick Kinsley in Ohio for reminding me of this, is another tool that you might be able to use for an external review is the new Civic Action Plan that has just come out from Campus Compact. And for those of you who are going to the conference next week, the 30th Anniversary Campus Compact Conference in Boston, you'll be hearing a lot more about the Civic Action Plan. And we're even talking about doing a webinar in the future on the Civic Action Plan. So that might be something to take a look at. So sorry, Julie, I just jumped in.
That's fine. That's great. I like a back and forth.
Okay, go ahead.
So because we had this new dynamic assessment director, when I said this is something we really need to do because we've kind of topped out at what we can do autonomously as a program. And there was a I really needed to educate him about service learning and what it meant to become more fully institutionalized. So here's some of the questions that he asked me as we started out. You can go to the next slide, Stephanie. So we had the desired scope is pretty big. We really wanted to get to the next step in institutionalizing and really help our leadership and our administrators to understand the steps that they really need to take to support this, which are policy level steps and different actions that we really as a program didn't have the ability to make. So that's why really we were aiming this to try to really get administrators on board and understanding the advantages and the benefits of doing this. We did have limited resources. We're a small program. I'm a part-time director because I'm also faculty, and I have 2 part-time staff people. We have a lot of service learning faculty who are really committed, but everybody is overstretched. So that's that was a real consideration. And then he asked the most important question, what is the burning question here? And so there it is. How can we be optimally institutionalized for long-term success and sustainability? That's you.
Okay. So,
Megan.
so in preparing for the review, you want to think about the materials that you'd want to give to prep the reviewers for coming to your campus and meeting with you all. And so you maybe want to provide the mission statements for your center, for your campus, organizational charts so they can see who reports to who, where the center is on the org chart. Obviously, as was just reviewed, the purpose and the goals for the program review, and also to be really clear about the roles and responsibilities of the review team. What's the scope of which what they're doing? So a lot of the things that Julia talked about, it's really helpful for the review team to be really clear on what is expected of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. You might want to prepare some kind of self-study report. Again, you could use other things that maybe you just finished strategic plan and that's not the purpose of your review. So you might want to provide that to the review team to review, is to look at your last strategic plan or any kind of report that you have. Maybe you just finished, in the West we call it WASC review. It's the state of, the regional accreditation, the Western accreditation for us. So in other parts of the country, like you might share your North Central accreditation report, or not the whole thing, but whatever is pertinent to your review. And then providing the reviewers with an outline early on of what they could expect, and ironing out, is it a 2-day, is it a 1-day? And letting them know who you're setting up meetings with, because maybe there can be some conversation back and forth if the reviewers are saying, but you're telling us you really want us to look at your relationships with the community, but it's looking like on the schedule you don't have any community partners. So making that available so that they can review it, give you any feedback, ask any questions ahead of time. Next slide. So one thing to consider is who will be on that review team. Are you wanting someone to be there from a peer institution? Do you want someone from a campus that based on who you're trying to convince, or we want you to be really strategic about this. So what kind of level person? Should it be someone who has experience with faculty and has a faculty background, but perhaps is now at a dean level, a chair level, a provost level even? Is there somebody that your provost or your president always refers to, like, oh, so-and-so at such and such, he's doing great stuff, or she's doing wonderful things. We should be looking at that institution when we work on our things. So that could be something that goes into consideration on who you bring. Obviously, what your budget is, how many people can you bring? I don't know. I haven't heard of any review team that's been more than 3 people. Partly maybe because of affordability and but also logistics, and but how many people do you want? And be strategic, and do you want to ask different types of people? Let's have one person who's got a strong faculty background, somebody else who's in the administrative role now and could talk very well about where the center sits on the campus, etc. And so I'm getting into what will be the role of each reviewer. Do they each play a different kind of role? And is there someone who's going to be the team leader? When I did the review, the one review I did, it was myself and one other person, and we were really clear. One of us was the team. It wasn't me. It was the other person. It was the team leader. And so when we went into situations, he always led with the first questions that were being asked. But that was something we negotiated ourselves and talked through. And then there was also one person on the campus who was the primary contact that we as a team of reviewers had. So any questions we had, whether it was logistics, whether it was a question about the reviews, prep material we were reading, whether it was a question about, any questions that we had clarification on from either the pre-reading or just in general, there was one person that we worked with, and that made it really easy and clear for us to know who to go through. And so I do recommend identifying a primary contact person for taking the lead with communication with the team.
So back to me. So we kind of went, if you see external reviews as a continuum, we went full blown. We had a big goal, which was to try to move towards more sustained institutionalization. And so big goal, big study. And also because we were using a process and a template that was already in place. We do external reviews for degree programs, and it also seemed, in terms of credibility and acknowledging service learning as an academic program, that it made sense for us to use that same process, which included a program self-study. With that, and so you can go to the next slide, because I think I talk more about this. So we used the national tool that's been around for a while, Andy Furco's assessment rubric. If you're not familiar with it, it's a really important tool. It's complex because it looks at all stakeholders, and then how service learning or community engagement is situated in terms of the overall philosophy and mission of the institution, and then how the institution is actually supporting it. So it kind of has all stakeholders, faculty, student, community partners, and then the institution as stakeholder in a sense. So because we were using that allowed me to suggest that we might get the best person to come in to do the review would be the national expert, who is Andy Furco. So we were really lucky that he accepted. We did have limited funding for a one-day review, and I felt, especially considering it was a big process, I was hoping that he would have some support. And so also Elaine Akeda was kind enough. We drew on our Bay Area networks, and Elaine was kind enough to step in and serve as a second in this process. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is just a kind of an overview about the pieces that were in our self-study that included these multiple data sources that I have a bulleted list, and next slide or something. And it was really important that it was collaborative. It wasn't just written by me. And we were lucky to have like an external consultant who was able to do some of the content analysis so that we weren't ourselves like actually analyzing all the data. And yeah, so it was a big piece of evidence-driven work. Can go to the next slide.
Can I just ask you a quick question, Julie, about this?
Sure.
So when you're putting all of these pieces together, so all of the different data sources and the different collaborations that you had on campus to help with this, what was your starting point? I mean, I'm thinking of a timeline for how much prep went into the actual 1 day or 2 days of an external review, the year or 6 months or 2 weeks, whatever it was that required.
So I started talking with the assessment director basically around January, February of 2015. I was hoping to get a lot more done. Then we started the process because you have to educate your collaborators, and he needed to understand institutionalization because we also had to design what our research protocol was and look at, there's a lot of different moving pieces. So, and a lot of conversations that you need to have. So we definitely started those and started looking at what were the driving questions in the spring, looking kind of benchmarking and looking at what the overall process would look like and the time frame. And then and then doing focus groups in spring. So we started to collect additional data that we needed. Over the summer, I started pulling things together pretty much on my own, bouncing some things off of him, but a lot of, most people are not working over the summer. During the fall, then we really came together and started kind of piecing out and delegating different pieces to different people. So there was actually, the self-study itself was completed a month before the external review. So it went out the first week of October. And then the reviewers came November 5th. So it's not, that's why one of my recommendations is start early. If you're going to do full blown like we did. It takes time because this is also, it is about critical reflection too, as everything we do is. So we have to put the time into having some of the dialogues and figuring out how, what the best way to present information is and be strategic.
Yeah, and I think you spoke to us about doing the review. I think you got us on board early in the year, like early in January. And although we weren't totally sure when exactly, we knew fall. And I think maybe it was based partly on when Andy could fly out to California. That might have been a deciding factor that it would be actually in November on that date.
Right, that was based on availability. Luckily, it wasn't any earlier because we would not have gotten the self-study. So I just took a screenshot, our table of contents. I'm actually super proud of this work, and just to give an idea of the pieces that were present in this self-study. And I have to say a really important piece of it, which was also one of the harder pieces to write, was the final piece, was the future trajectory. But in a sense, that's been a really important piece because being able to articulate these pieces has helped us to move forward on some of the ideas that we put together there. So, yeah.
And as a reviewer, I'll say the Director of Assessment at Dominican provided us with the self-study and another document. Do you remember what that was, Julia?
Might have just been our 10-year celebration
or
the agenda. I don't.
Yeah, there was another. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. I should know off the but anyway, about a month prior to us going to Dominican, we were given this 65-page document and it was a 90-page document. So I feel like maybe it was a accreditation document or something. Do you know?
I think it might have been. It might have been the roles and responsibilities of the external reviewers.
No, this was a 90-page, 90.
Well, I did not write it.
So all I'm saying, though, what I'm trying to say is that the reviewers were given at least a month to look over, which, you know, we all have other jobs as well. So that was really great. And then what was really helpful is that we had about maybe 2 to 3 weeks, 2 weeks before we visited, we had a conference call with the head of assessment, our main contact, so that we could ask him any questions that we had based on what he had already sent. And it gave us a chance to review the schedule of what we would be doing when we got there. It caused us to shift a few things around, saying we really had a chance to talk to him and ask him what, you know, to reiterate sort of really in his words, what the main goals were, what they were hoping to have come out of it as outcomes. And that caused us to together on the phone look at the schedule and say, you know, maybe we need a little more time here. Maybe we need to not meet with this group because we're really pinched for time. We'd rather meet, like, let's get some students in there. And so we adjusted the schedule. So I really, for me, I like that process that we had time to review and read a bit and then have some questions that we could ask and get a response, because that helped us to really hone in on our thinking as reviewers in prepping for the visit. So we can probably move to the next slide.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is just an idea of the kind of data points so that we used. I don't think it's everything, but these are the main pieces. The focus groups that was good content. We didn't do a community partner focus group. I think that would have been good to add. It just came down to how many people we could get in the room at once. And we have about 7 or 8 years of data because we have a designation. And so our institutional research can pull that up and actually produce, we could show retention rates of students enrolled as freshmen in service learning courses, and also demographics, which was important because there was a lot of people on campus saying, oh, service learning isn't accessible, and we have a lot of first-gen students, and actually it showed that first-gen and students of color were disproportionately represented in service learning classes. So that's important data. And as I said, I'm an assessment geek, and so I've been doing annual assessment for a while of our service learning student learning outcomes. So we have all of that. And then the numbers and all of the quantitative data that we're pretty meticulous about gathering. But I would say a good mix of qualitative. I mean, I'm always more interested in the qualitative data, and that's why it was really great to have somebody who could actually take the 2 years of student surveys and do a content analysis. It was my favorite part of the self-study, actually, the student voices. Yeah, so we already talked about a lot of this, starting to think early, especially so that you can fill in data gaps and have time to develop like some good protocols for focus groups, and even designing a survey takes time. To do one that's going to actually give you information, really valuable information. Work with people you have who know how to do this. And I'm always like, if you're not a social scientist, make friends with a social scientist. If you're interested in a really evidence-driven self-study. And yeah, collaborators were key. Honestly, the fall, trying to get this thing written in the way that we had kind of raised the bar to do it was extremely stressful, but we would come together. I had my group. I was able to get a unit for another colleague to support the writing. And so you have to be creative and think about how you can create that team. There's Megan. Okay.
Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about planning the site visit and things to consider. And then I'm going to, Megan Voorhees has joined us now, and so I'll talk just a little bit about this and then let Megan take over in just a bit. So, and I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know if you're all hearing it.
Yeah, I hear it.
Okay, so you want to, things to consider when doing planning the site visit. Return to the goals for the review and let those goals determine who the reviewers should meet. So when you're looking at your agenda and setting it out, you want to think about, like we had to make a decision because we were only there for one day. Were we going to meet with community partners or students? We just didn't have enough time in the day with everyone else we had to meet with. And so we had to pick. And so as Julia mentioned, we didn't do the community partners group. So depending on what your goals are, you know, that'll help set the guidelines for who the reviewers should meet. Again, this is being incredibly strategic and thoughtful and hopefully working with your colleagues on the campus who are supporting this review to really make sure that if it's meeting with the president or meeting with other administrators, they make the time and getting that on the schedule. Having them recognize the importance of this. We were able to, you know, meet with the president and a variety of other folks who it was really important and key that we met with. Will the reviewers give an in-person report to someone? And if so, who would that be? As it turned out, we were meeting with the president late in the day, and we met with the team, the group that we met with at the beginning of the day came, which was made up of different VPs, came back together at the end of the day. And so we had a realization, wow, they're going to be expecting us to give at least some type of overview of what we saw and heard from that one day. And so we realized we wanted a little bit of time for us to just be able, the two reviewers, for us to meet individually, I mean, just the two of us, to just quickly talk through what we might want to present back to that group, what we were ready to say, you know, based on what we'd heard. You know, you want to figure out, is it a 2-day visit? Is it a 1 day? We were only doing 1 day at Dominican, and so we started pretty early. I think we started at 8 or 8:30 in the morning and went till about 5, 4:30 or 5. You know, they invited us to go to dinner with the director of assessment, and we determined we were too brain dead. But, you know, those are things to be thinking about. So this fourth bullet, you know, be sure to give the reviewers time to reflect and absorb what they're learning. We had a few breaks built in, 10, 15 minutes, but sometimes those, because the conversations were going so well, those breaks got, you know, cut into. So that's also a little padding in case you are running over on time. And we had a eating lunch with this when we met with the students. We ate with them while of course that was, you know, we always feed our students so that they'll show up. So we overlapped that at lunchtime so we could get something to eat as well. And that's an important thing to do, is know what your reviewers' eating preferences are, because you know, if there's certain food allergies and things like that, that's always important to get to know as well. So that's just a little side. And then it was really important to us for a variety of reasons that all of our meetings were not held in the exact same room all day long. Number one, it was helpful for us as reviewers just to also do some reflection and refresh by walking from one place to another. It also gave us a sense of the campus, and then also it helped us to see where different things were located. It was really important to us to see where the service learning office and the program was located, what kind of space they had there, how easy or difficult it was to get there, where it was located geographically, was it in the center of the campus or not. And so for all those different reasons, I think it's important to perhaps really consider moving the reviewers to different locations as time allows, for them to also get that sense, especially if they're not familiar with their campus. So I'm going to turn it over to Megan now. And Megan, you can fill in anything that I haven't said and then kind of take over from here as we move forward if you're comfortable with that.
So I apologize to everyone for joining late. Until 3 minutes ago, I didn't know I was joining late. I got an email earlier today that made me think we were starting at 1 o'clock PST, and I'd always had the time wrong, but it turns out I shouldn't have switched time. So sincere apologies for joining in late. I think I'll just say, and it may have been said in introductions, that I've been on 3 review teams as a reviewer, and I can't emphasize enough that it benefits your campus that your reviewers have some time to reflect. There were a couple of times where I was put in front of the provost without any time to reflect and asked to say, like, what major changes should happen on this campus? And you want your reviewers to have some time to really integrate and think about what they've heard and be strategic for you in terms of what they communicate to others.
So Elaine's already touched on. Are we good? Elaine's already touched on these points, but it was really important that we follow good protocol and that I wasn't seen to be tainting this process at all. So again, that's why it was great to be able to go through our assessment office and have our director of assessment be the main point. In fact, I did reply to one email, and that Elaine and Andy were copied on, and he told me that's not protocol. I was like, okay, that's good. So we were very clear, and that's also so that the reviewers, it's a courtesy to the reviewers so that they're not having to feel like they're answering emails from multiple people. So there's a clear line of communication. And also he made all the arrangements, and he knew to ask about dietary needs. He's done a lot of these. We worked on the agenda. He invited the other administrators and made sure that all of the meetings were in place. I worked on students and faculty. Yeah, and as we had agreed, got the self-study out and did this pre-visit call, which I think was important. I wasn't on the call either. I think he was able to kind of give some of the context and more of the nuances. I don't know, Elaine, do you want to say anything about that call?
Right, it was definitely helpful, really helpful. I would say invaluable to have that call, because you're right. He was able to. There were things that we were perceiving from the self-study, or sort of reading between the lines and wanting to check was what we were starting to feel. Was that accurate? And so it was really helpful to have that sort of check-in with him and ask him some of those clarifying questions. And it just helped us to feel much more prepared for when we were actually doing the visit. And it also helped us to figure out what were some of the key questions that we wanted to ask the different people that we would be meeting with. So we had a few questions already in our heads or on paper for when we came to the campus, specifically for certain people, partly based on our assessment of what we'd read. So yeah, very helpful.
Okay. So Elaine already talked a little bit about what this day looked like, and definitely we did need to negotiate. We did think again, I mean, the community partners were not as present in this, but part of that was tactical in that we have, we as a program are very conscious of reciprocity and community voice and have really worked hard to create these partnerships. But because the focus was really on institutionalization and the things that the institution needed to do, we had community partner voice in the self-study, but there really was no time for it during the day. And also with community partners, we didn't know how many we'd be able to assemble. So we did really have to think about which stakeholders for the purposes that we had were the most important. And to be able also to leverage, I mean, it's a two-way street. It's the external reviewers are getting information, but the people who are in the meeting are also being educated, so, and getting information. So it was tightly orchestrated. We did, and our assessment of director, I think was very conscious too of needing, the reviewers needing time to breathe and, you know, to nourish themselves. But there wasn't enough time either. We did move some things around at the last minute per their request, and that was great and fine. We reserved a central room because that's where we had snacks, and we tried to keep, you know, we tried to keep things fresh and nice in that room, but we did move them around, as Elaine already discussed. So we're kind of still in this phase, but, you know, directly after, at the end of the day, I think, yeah, that's over. It went really well. I think we felt really good about it. So there was a good feeling, and we were definitely tired. And I think we waited, I think it was a few weeks, and then the external reviewers submitted their report and recommendations to our assessment director, who then disseminated them to myself and the other key vice presidents and provosts, etc. And I distributed to faculty. So the value of having done this very formal process is that I get support all the way to make sure that now we will create a memorandum of agreement, an MOU, based on these recommendations, based on what my supervisor in conversation with other administrators feels like they can really move on, and where the broken links that can be fixed. So we're still in that process. I think it's a good process. And some other happy byproducts is that we earned some cred. The assessment director is definitely advertising and holding up our process as being, you know, really excellent, the gold standard. And we are moving forward on some of the steps we articulated, such as a minor in community action and social change. So that's something that we're able to do as a faculty, and don't need to wait for the institution to sign off on. I think even though it was a lot of work, we feel like we made an unrefutable case that really nobody has pushed back on. So the evidence is really important. And there was a lot of community building, and I know I learned a lot. And I also built new relationships, and I was also able to really critically reflect on this work. It's Megan.
So, before I dive into recommendations for reviewers, I just want to add a couple things to during the site visit for reviewers. It became really clear to me on my first review team, and then I took more action on the other two reviews that I led, that reviewers also have an incredible opportunity to just facilitate discussion between different stakeholders for the center. So it's not just about gathering information for a written report, but how often does a public service center convene their stakeholders and get them dreaming and thinking about what might happen in the future? So I think for reviewers, it's really important to think about where is it that you can also play that role of getting people excited about next steps for a center and getting invested in the work that might happen in the future or might happen across the campus in support of service learning and engaged scholarship. So that's a lot to put on reviewers. You don't have to take on that role, but I do think that, you know, everyone is so busy that it's not often that you get students or faculty or community partners together. And so it's a chance to create some excitement and get people dreaming and more invested in supporting the work of the campus in this area. For reviewers, a few recommendations that I learned the hard way. Make sure that you're really clear about roles and who's going to do what on the team, who's going to lead which parts and which discussions. So some of you on the team might have more experience working with students or community partners, so you might lead that section. It also helps to divvy up the work in terms of who's thinking about how the questions might change, because even though you should plan all your questions in advance, as you dive into the day or several days of site visits, your questions will change, and so you'll want to keep coming back together to see if those need to be changed. I would also suggest that ahead of time you need to decide how you're going to produce the written report. On 2 of the 3 reviews I was part of, I was the lead writer, and then others just gave feedback. So then that changed how I took notes. And then on the other one, each of us took sections. So then again, it depended, it affected who was leading which discussion, so that we could be listening for how we might write that part of the report. And then I think Elaine already touched on this, and Julia, but you want to make sure that you pace yourself during the site visit. The first site visit I did was only 1 day long, and after that I learned that it really had to be 2 days. It's partly maybe just me, that I'm slow and I need time to really think and reflect and be thoughtful about what I'm hearing and learning, and if there's other questions I need to ask. So if that's not possible, just make sure that you have time throughout the day to sort of pull back and listen for what you're not hearing.
Okay, and I don't know, Megan, if I gotta mute you, sorry. If joining us a little bit later, and some of the key points that were on previous slides, if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, or if you felt like you got stuff across, we can move into some questions.
I don't want to repeat anything that's so too much. I will just say that I was the director of a public service center. I never thought of doing an external review. It wasn't something that we did within my division of student affairs on my campus. And now, having been part of 3 reviews, I strongly recommend it, even if it's just inviting a couple colleagues from campuses that are close by and saying, can you come in and meet with some of our stakeholders and give us suggestions on what we're doing, and I'll do the same for you next year. I mean, it doesn't have to be a really extensive formal process. I think there's a lot of value to that. But if nothing else, like, solicit that feedback and get those ideas. It's powerful to spend a couple days learning from your colleagues and learn from others who are working in the field about what you might be doing or how you might be doing it differently, or just to hear that things are going really well and that you should keep doing what you're doing.
That brings up one question around, and this was mentioned a little bit during the presentation, but sort of what the continuum is for external reviews. I mean, so we heard Julia talking about the self-study. Get the impression self-study does not have to be part of every external review. So I don't know if this is formalized at all, but if you all can address just what you've seen as far as the options around external reviews as sort of broad categories of starting off here and then like diving in the entire way.
Just to start us off, so I was on 3 reviews, and they were with very different campuses with different intentions. And one was really an informal process where the director of the Public Service Center for a large university really just wanted feedback from a couple of colleagues. She brought 2 of us in. We just talked with her. We never worked with the assessment office. And then we met with groups and did a short written report. But then I was actually called in later to meet with the vice president around some of our recommendations. So it did become a little bit more formal. So you have to pay attention to how information might get used over time. Others, it was a really extensive process for the campuses every 5 years for all of their programs. So they had an elaborate process for it. Although in all 3 cases, I never worked with like a director of assessment like Julia did. I think it would be great. It was hard sometimes to have my primary contact be the person I was also reviewing. So to have an intermediary would be great if you can do it. So like I said, I think the value in just asking for some and give some attention to what you're doing and give some suggestions, and a more formal process that, you know, future staff can come in, faculty or your advisors, read the report and say, oh, okay, I see what you've been doing and where you might go, can also be quite useful.
Julie, did you want to contribute at all? I just didn't. I had you muted, so I didn't want you to.
Well, I don't really know. I don't really know the range. I just know that if I had done something less formal, I would not be able to leverage it in the way that we needed to leverage. Although I think it's a wonderful idea to bring in somebody externally to really bring people together and brainstorm and imagine and envision the future trajectory of the program and get new ideas. I just think you also need to be at a certain place in order to do that, and we weren't there. So it really, as I kind of started out saying, it really depends on the context of where your institution is and yeah, what's most needed, and yeah, and what kind of tools you have, because I had a little bit more access to resources because I used this process that was kind of more universal at our institution, which is this more formal institutional review process. So I could leverage that.
Yeah. So I'm wondering too, you know, when you look at in one of the slides that was showing the different possibilities for the sort of frameworks through which you could do an external review. If there are like templates or something that you all as reviewers, for those of you, the two on the call that have done the reviews, that you've created that with any intention of kind of, well, institutionalizing that in and of itself as a kind of more formal process of here's the way that you would sort of translate the FERCO rubric into a template for external review or the NERGI, whatever it is, if you all have seen that or done that yourselves as reviewers.
No, yes and no. So one review I did was based on the CAS standards, which I think was mentioned earlier in the presentation, and they had done a review before, so we really just used the template. I mean, I think if a campus has done a review before, it helps to actually work from their previous report, so that reports over the course of many years can be compared with one another. I think it would be interesting. I know in sort of my research for these presentations, I mean, a number of campuses have a program review handbook, and so very clear about exactly what needs to happen for their campus. But there's nothing that I can find that was sort of a national standard for how you do an external review.
And I would just say that even though we had a program review handbook for doing external reviews, we needed to adapt that because we're not a degree granting program. So a lot of the different components needed to be quite different. So there was still an adaptation process as part of that. But yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I know about. And I thought the rubric worked really, really well, and to be able to use a nationally vetted rubric has power in it too.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as this work moves forward, and especially as Elaine was mentioning in the beginning of the call with the 30th anniversary of Campus Compact as a network, and development of some of the sort of standards and consistencies that folks are trying to employ that kind of legitimizes or not the work that we're doing, and that this is a whole area, whether it's for not certification, but figuring out what makes a good external reviewer or a review process or a template to use so that there's some consistency of, like versus like. I think it's going to be a cool conversation to continue having as we move forward. What we're going
to add in, Stephanie, my guess is to do that well, we'd actually need a set of 8 to 12 templates. depending on just having worked on 3 different campuses where, you know, one center was housed in academic affairs, another in student affairs, and one reported to both. Like, it just looks really different on every campus, what programs are trying to do and what they're charged to do and where they might go forward in the future. I think it's an interesting process, but to just say that I think that's also what folks have to take into account when they're deciding on where how they're moving forward, is who you are and who your campus is and where you're headed.
So I want to, there is one question that came in via the Q&A box. And so this person's asking, I'm interested in knowing the cost of an external review like the ones you've described. I mean, there's the cost of travel and paying the reviewer and things like that. There's also other kinds of costs, like I can't imagine the amount of time that Julia put in doing the self-study. I don't know if you would have done the self-study just on its own, but or if it was really in preparation fully 100% for the external review. But maybe Julia, you could start out talking a little bit about the costs of the actual review, and again, it's sort of contextualized in that some of the costs aren't hard money. But and then Megan, if she has anything to add.
So again, working with the Office of Assessment, because really I didn't have a budget line for this, and so the kinds of things that the Office of Assessment helped with was, if you're going to have a focus group, for instance, you need hospitality. And for even to have adjunct faculty participate, we're in the process of negotiating adjunct unions, so it's really important to compensate adjuncts also for any time. So there's those kinds of considerations. He did bring in an external facilitator for the focus groups, so he paid her. So I'm just saying what kind of budget lines. I don't know the overall costs. These are not huge amounts, but they do add up. I think the most significant was that because I couldn't take, so we do for chairs who are doing program review, there is a unit of release time for them. I honestly could not use a unit of release time because I have time teach, and there is no one unit I could release myself from, and I have time direct this program. So I was able to negotiate so that unit could be used for another colleague to assist. So unit is equal to about 40 hours of time. Other costs beyond, the honorarium for the reviewers, and that could vary. Travel, hotel if they need to stay in the hotel, and then food for the day. Am I missing any? Yeah, so those are, I think you could do an external review without spending a lot of actual money, but it will always cost something.
I think what Julia just said at the end is accurate. That you can do a range of costs. I worked with one campus, their budget was $2,000, all they could spend. I will say as a reviewer, I think I got paid about $2 an hour for the work that I did on that particular project. So for those of you who are thinking about being reviewers, I will say it's a chance to learn and grow and develop as a professional in the field. It's not a chance to make a lot of extra money. And then I'm working with the campus now that they're working with only local reviewers. They're able to bring in more people, and we're really doing it as colleagues and as a local community. And they're spending very little money to do it.
So none of you are able to give an exact dollar figure.
Somewhere between 2,000 and 25,000.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really important is, Julia kind of mentioned it a little bit, is leveraging. Where can you find pots of money that was interesting to me to hear about, you could buy out a little bit of an adjunct, somebody's time, a half unit or 1 unit, whatever. So that's creative thinking in some ways. And depending on who you're trying to get administratively to support this, like, do you go to the provost and present this, and then beyond just getting the provost to say, yeah, I support this, this is a good idea, let's do a review, say, and how much are you able to contribute? Here's the different things that are, Julia was mentioning a bunch of different budget line items, and so if the provost says, well, I'll contribute $1,000 to cover the travel and partial honoraria for the review team, all right, great, I might be able to then get my faculty development office to pitch in to match that with another 1,000, and then we can make sure we bring in 2 reviewers or 3 reviewers. So I would try and think creatively about sources you could leverage, and be strategic about that too, and look at those different pots of money, where you might be able to get some small funding, even if the student body somehow with their fees, I don't know, maybe Megan can talk about this, how difficult it is to say, oh, could we get any ASB funds to cover the lunch for the students or something like that to spread out the costs.
I think student fees on every campus are different, so I'll leave that one. I will say that I had, if I was going to do the process, is to find a graduate student who's interested in community engagement or who's in student affairs. I mean, this is a great graduate student project, not to facilitate everything, but to lead it and plan it and then learn along the way. So if you're on a campus where you have access to graduate students who are doing those kinds of projects, maybe this is something that they could take on, just to decrease the labor time a little bit.
So we're going to have one more question for all 3 of you, and then we'll conclude and do some little last steps for reminders about how this information will get back to you. If you do have a last minute question, feel free to type it in the chat box or the Q&A box. But the last question is, I mean, given all of the sort of preparation and the work that's going into the day of and then follow up, if you're in the consultant role as the external reviewer, is there a sort of key piece of information that you've maybe painfully discovered is critical to have, that's been kind of a lesson learned for you in order to make the review as successful as possible, something that maybe isn't necessarily intuitive? And then, like Julia, for you, was there any piece of information or data that you wished had been included that moving forward you think would be a sort of critical component from the campus perspective?
I'll go. A couple of things that I'd say. I'd say that if no matter what position you're in, if you're thinking about doing an external review to look at staffing issues, and it's not appropriate to ask external reviewers to do performance reviews or to do that kind of work that supervisors should be doing. And I will say I've actually been contacted by several campuses where it became clear that that's what they wanted. And so if you're going to be a reviewer, to also ask enough questions, because I don't think that's an appropriate role for an external reviewer. And then again, I would just reiterate that I'm sure there's some of you that's just like, there's just no way to have the time or the capacity or the money to do a big formal external review. See if you can make that happen, and if not, then try to do a scaled down version. I think it's a really useful way to even just develop a collegial relationship with others in the field.
We were so data heavy that I'm trying to put myself back there in that space, and I'm sure there's some things that I realized after, but I mean, there's just data that I'm interested in. I don't know if it would have helped us make our case anymore. Probably more data about what other people are doing on campus that is community engagement, or that they're calling community engagement, or in some cases that they're calling service learning, but it's not designated and we don't know about it. So probably more data about what the rest of the campus is doing, and yeah, more data from overall faculty about their understanding and perceptions of service learning on campus. So that was a survey that we just didn't have time to go to send out, but I would definitely recommend being able to benchmark all faculty perspective on community engagement or service learning or whatever it is that you're looking at. So that was a missing piece. I got there. Yeah. So why people, there were, like on our campus, there are people who say, oh, service learning is too narrow. Oh, it's a lot of paperwork. Oh, you can only have one partner, which isn't true. There's a lot of myths on our campus about service learning, and we could have used more data, more actual data rather than anecdotal. So that was a missing piece.
Thanks. Anything to add, Elaine, from a reviewer perspective?
No, but there was something Megan said that I think when you're thinking about review, again, if you can't do the full blown, have a plan B. So go in there and propose perhaps the full blown, but if you get the pushback saying we don't have the budget, or we can't provide you with support to get it, set up, have a plan B. Like, be ready to say, well, what about this? And maybe it's just one component of it that is the most important to you. So don't just go in there asking for support for a big, huge thing and not have a plan B, and maybe that's a good strategy for everything. But I think that's always a wise idea to, yeah.
And I could add on to that just by saying, the first time the assessment director, I was refused an external review because there was kind of the attitude, which is also indicative of our issue, service learning is fine. Like, we don't need to review it. And also this idea that external review is kind of punitive. No, it's about being ongoing improvement, right? So I pushed back, and actually the poor assessment director was brand new, and then so he took it back again, and he got approval for a mini review, which means that we could have one person locally. And then as we went forward, and I kind of, this is what institutionalization is about, look at this rubric, and then he's like, that's it. We are, I'm going to get us more funding so that, we are able to bring in Andy. So, we kind of, it was incremental, and actually we got much further than we thought we would when we entered. So it's an opportunity to kind of change some minds, and yeah. So don't give up even if you get pushed back. You can, we're very, we hold on and keep pushing. And
a plan C also might be if you're on a campus where this kind of work is happening in multiple spaces. So I worked with a big public university, and once I got there, I was working with one center, but it's like, oh, well, service learning is housed here, and there's community engagement here, and there's field studies that the larger community sees as service learning happening over here. Plan C might be that you bring all those centers together, or different groups, and say, can we all help to fund a review that helps strengthen everybody's work across campus? So that would be a much more complicated review process, but might be even more helpful.
Great. Thank you, all of you, for participating today and for sharing your perspective and your experience with those of us that are on the call today. As a reminder, this has been recorded, so we'll upload it to YouTube, and you'll be emailed a link to the webinar along with all of the slides. There will be contact information for all of our facilitators today, whether they knew that or not before this moment. And then again, a link to an evaluation, so you can let us know how we're doing, and if there are areas that you would like to see, areas of content that you would like to see developed into webinars moving into next year. Our next webinar will be in April around community partnerships, and we'll be sending out information on that very soon. Again, thank you all very much for being here as facilitators, and Hope you have a good rest of your day.